Chapter 15:13, Furious Shadow. Sunny had transformed himself in the image of the Serpent King. However, he was not as powerful as Daron. His onyx body was giant compared to a human, but it was still much smaller than the Azure Serpent had been. Much more importantly than that, it did not possess the power of a great beast. Sunny was merely an ascended after all, and even though the shadows he had used to form the onyx serpent were more powerful and ancient than him, the essence that had manifested them was that of a master. 6 shadows were augmenting his shell this time, but Nephis was not here to grant him the blessing of her flame. And although the Dread Lord was weaker than the Azure Serpent had been, the dragon was also not littered with gruesome wounds and nearing death. None of it mattered to Sunny, though. Consumed by frenzy, all he knew was the mad desire to rip his enemy apart. "Kill you, I'll kill you." His fangs pressed down on the impregnable dragon scales, leaving deep grooves on their dark surface. His mighty body coiled tight around the Dread Lord, restraining and crushing him. "I'll kill you no matter what." However, the harrowing dragon was full of ire and murderous will, as well. Even though his most dreadful power, the tyrannical authority of his voice, had proved to be futile when used against Sunny, he still had plenty of means to destroy the insolent slave. A furious roar shook the dim throne room. And at the same time, an insidious whisper resounded in Sunny's clouded mind. "All that effort to escape, and yet here you are." Sunny vaguely realized that the Dread Lord was confusing him with the Mad Prince and doubled his effort to tear open the vile worm's throat. At that moment, however, his enemy finally moved. Its tail whipped across the great hall once again, crushing countless soul-stealer vessels. At the same time, he strained his wings against the coils of Sunny's giant armored body, causing cracks to appear on the surface of the mantle. Much worse than that, the Dread Lord lowered his head and bit into Sunny's own neck. His porcelain fangs pierced the onyx armor plates and sank into the shadows, tearing them apart. It did not matter, though. Hidden deep within the onyx serpent, Sunny let out a mad laugh. More shadows flowed from the open gate of the shadow lantern, mending the wounds delivered to his shell by the odious dragon. He had plenty more hidden away, and his essence was nearly limitless here in twilight. If the Dread Lord wished to win, he had his work cut out for him. "I'll bleed you dry, one drop at a time." Finally, one of his fangs slid between 2 scales and cut into the tough hide beneath. Tasting blood, or maybe simply imagining tasting it with a tongue made of shadows, Sunny let out a triumphant growl. Continuing to maul the shell's neck, the Dread Lord threw his massive body down. Tangled together, the dragon and the serpent rolled across the ruined floor of the throne room, making the whole palace shudder. The marble tiles were pulverized into dust, and countless hollow vessels were turned into puddles of shattered bones and blood. "Is Kai alive?" The thought flashed in Sunny's mind and disappeared. He did not care. He did not even really remember who Kai was. All he could feel was bloodlust and rage. Crushed under the weight of the Dread Lord, his serpentine body was coming undone. His neck was shredded, and his head was moments away from becoming separated from his body. Even though he was mending the damage, the hateful dragon was tearing through the shadows faster than Sunny could manifest them. But he tasted the dragon's blood. Sunny was full of dark glee. His coils moved, a ridge of spikes growing from his spine. His body was like a circular saw now, sending clouds of sparks flying from the points where it ground against the Dread Lord's scales. More blood flowed, falling to the shattered floor like drops of silver flame. Flame! Letting go of Sunny's neck, the dragon pierced him with a loathsome gaze and opened his maw. Hidden within the serpentine shell, Sunny gritted his teeth. But what came out of the Dread Lord's maw was not a torrent of flame instead. It was an eerie, melodious, otherworldly sound. It almost sounded like a song. And enveloped by that harrowing song, the giant body of the onyx serpent shattered. Terrible cracks appeared on its surface, the shadows melting into a tenebrous haze. A deafening sonic boom sent a hurricane of stone dust into the air, and Sonny was thrown away, his shell torn asunder. Freed from the crushing embrace of his coils, the dread lord rose, his eyes burning with demented hatred. His gaze landed on the torn remains of the onyx serpent, searching for the human body hidden within. As he was looking, though, a radiant arrow hit the side of his head. A fiery explosion bloomed, pushing the dragon's head aside. Hovering near the cracked dome of the palace, Kai gritted his teeth and drew the string of his bow again. The dread lord opened his maw, wanting to give the archer another command. But at that moment Kai screamed, "Shut your mouth, you traitor!" And although the authority of his voice was not nearly powerful enough to restrain the defiled saint, the dread lord's jaws did freeze for a moment. That moment was all Sonny needed. The two parts of his severed body slithered across the shattered floor like snakes and connected, almost instantly growing back together. His ravaged head rose, baring its fangs, and sank them into one of the harrowing dragon's wings. There the scales were much thinner and easier to pierce. More soul-stealer vessels were already pouring into the throne room. These were not as weak as the previous ones. Very few of them died from the fall, which meant that there were much more awakened and ascended among them. Kai let another arrow loose. The dread lord looked around in fury and let out an infuriated growl. Then his wings moved, raising a hurricane. The bastard was trying to fly away. Or so Sonny thought. Unwilling to let the enemy go, he tried to hold on to the dragon's wing, but it was of no use. He was thrown aside, crashing heavily on the ground. The walls of the throne room were falling now, unable to withstand the battle of two giant beasts. Soon the whole palace was going to collapse. Surrounded by hurricane winds and dust, the dread lord was rising into the air. He was already reaching the broken dome, ready to break through it and cause the entire thing to crumble. Sonny looked up in fury. "No, no, no, you won't escape." Coiling his massive body like a spring, he sent it flying into the air. His leap produced a shockwave that shattered the walls of the throne room and made the palace quake. His head collided with the dread lord, sending the dragon crashing through the remains of the dome. But then, gravity pulled him down. Sonny howled in fury, and responding to his wrath, his tenebrous body flowed and shifted, changing form. Giant wings sprouted from his back and struck against the air, sending him flying up. Wreathed in darkness, a grotesque figure pursued the harrowing dragon into the sky. A moment later, the six chitinous legs of a giant, monstrous butterfly made of shadows struck the dread lord's scales. The dome of the Serpent King's palace entirely collapsed, falling under its own weight in a colossal cloud of dust. Two enormous, dark figures rose from the cloud, vaguely visible as they tangled together in a furious struggle. Down on the streets of the city, Nephis was making her way to the crumbling palace. She was fighting against the human flood, the radiance of her skin shining brightly in the dim twilight of the early dawn. Her incandescent sword had turned into a blur, followed by a trail of crimson haze. She had long lost count of how many enemies she cut down, how many bodies she sundered, and how much time had passed since the start of this nightmarish battle. No matter how many vessels of the Soul Stealer she destroyed, their number never decreased. Instead, it only grew. More and more of them flooded from all sides, rushing to pierce her flesh with their swords, their spears, their arrows, their nails and teeth. Their power had grown as well. There were more awakened warriors surrounding her now and more ascended. Their powers were like a constant hail that relentlessly assaulted her, lethal and unpredictable, growing more perilous with each step she took. But something else grew with it as well. Her will. Slowly but surely, Nephi's was shaking off the burden of doubt that had covered her heart like rust. At some point, little by little, its weight had added up, until she became pressed into the ground by it without even noticing. Here, in the throes of this macabre slaughter, there was no place for doubt. There was only combat, steps, lunges, and feints, the movements of her sword, the movements of her body, the measured ruthlessness of her mind, the cold lethality of her skill, the empty eyes of her enemies, the perilous sheen of their weapons, and the inevitable moments of their deaths. This was clarity. This was the stark world where only pain and will existed. She was always tormented by harrowing pain. Pain burned everything away, leaving only will. And Neph's will was to kill them all. She cut through countless humans, erasing them from existence with her sword. Their bodies came undone under its blade, forming a gruesome path. A river of blood flowed where she had passed, paving the way. Her blood was in that river as well. Nephi's moved with dreadful speed and chilling precision, rending the flesh of her enemies like a radiant, flawless, fatal machine. Lifeless corpses fell to her feet, men and women, young and old, all severed and mutilated, their bodies gaping with horrible wounds. But she wasn't unscathed either. Just then, an awakened warrior used a strange aspect ability and bypassed the steel wall of her defense. His cleaver landed on her shoulder, biting into the chainmail. Her armor held, and her bones held as well. But the impact slowed her down, allowing an ascended champion to ram a spear into her back. The chainmail broke, the white tunic beneath it was pierced, the spearhead plunged into her flesh. Snarling, Nephi sent the awakened flying with a kick and twisted, her sword cutting through the shaft of the spear and the ascended's head. The bloodied spearhead dissolved into a rain of sparks, and the radiance suffusing Neph's skin dimmed a little. Instead of blood, white flame flowed from the wound on her back, mending the torn muscles and broken skin. A moment later, the wound was gone, only the pain remained. Nephi's gritted her teeth, the same flame burning in her eyes. "Come, all of you." She plunged into the frenzied mob, calling upon the fires of her soul. Soon, a hurricane of incinerating flames spread through the human river, devouring all who could not resist it. Those who could were cut down by the spirit of light dancing in the midst of the blinding inferno, her sword merciless and unrestrained. The distant palace drew nearer. Nephi's had unleashed the flames to burn her enemies, but she couldn't maintain the blaze around herself constantly. Her reserves of essence, no matter how deep, would run out too fast that way. In the end, she released the control of the flame, leaving a burning street in her wake. The hungry fire spread, devouring the broken buildings. The endless, relentless assault of the hollow-eyed vessels continued, unchanged. More and more enemies broke through her defenses, leaving terrible marks on her body. Her bones were broken. Her flesh was cut. Her armor became shattered and torn, full of holes, until it crumbled completely, disappearing into a whirlwind of sparks and leaving only a tattered tunic to cover her radiant body. A sharp sword slithered its way to her chest, piercing her heart. Nephi swayed slightly and stared at the man who was holding the sword, a white inferno burning in her eyes. Then she reached with her hand and grabbed his throat, crushing it in an incinerating grasp. The sword slid out of her chest, followed by a gust of flame. At the same time, a battle axe landed on her shoulder, cutting deep, and a beak of a war hammer struck her head. But no blood poured out of the fatal wounds, only fire. Nephi's moved, severing the bodies of everyone around her. She did not fall, did not stagger. She did not even slow down. If anything, it seemed as though she had become even faster, even brighter, even deadlier. Washed by the white flame, the harrowing wounds disappeared in the beautiful radiance. Nephi's was not going to die yet. No, perhaps she was only getting started. Losing all restraint and not caring about the pain and the damage dealt to her body anymore, she lunged at her enemies, forcing them to reel back. I. Her sword tore through their bodies, leaving only death and scattering ash in its wake. We'll show you. Terrible blows rained on her body, but all the gruesome damage they dealt was washed away by the white radiance. The horror. All around her, the streets of twilight were being devoured by the spreading blaze of the immortal flame. Nephis was like an undying, insatiable monster of flame that had taken the form of a slender young woman. Now that she had discarded her doubt and her fear, the true horror of her aspect was finally unleashed. No matter how her enemies cut and pierced her radiant body, nothing seemed capable of bringing her down. Her own sword, however, was like an incandescent omen of destruction and ruin, inevitable and inescapable, cutting down everything that stood in its way. Countless lives were melting in front of her merciless blade. Her mind was like a white void. Pain had become will had become flame. Doubt had become ash. Nephis cut a road of blood and scorched bodies through the human flood, refusing to go down. Why would she? These swords, these spears, these arrows, these nails and teeth, she would withstand them all. Using her dormant ability did not diminish her essence, and so she would continue to kill and maim and burn until Soul Stealer came in person to put a stop to her. As long as there was fire, she would light herself on fire. She would endure its harrowing blessing. She would persist. For now, of course, even the undying were not invulnerable. No one was. Nephis was going to make a fatal mistake eventually. Fatigue and mental strain would accumulate, draining her strength away. Then she would be caught and pinned down or obliterated entirely. But until that happened, she would continue to burn. Burn brightly in the dim twilight of the endless dawn. High in the sky above twilight, Sunny was being mauled by the dread Lord. The monstrous butterfly shell he had hastily created was battered and torn, bleeding shadows into the air. The shadows dissipated into the beautiful radiance of dawn, disappearing. He had spent months on Alethia's island, fighting against and being killed by all kinds of harrowing creatures. Of course, he had learned a lot about his killers during that time. The hollow butterfly was harder to fathom because it lacked a soul, though, and so its shell was rough and unstable. Sunny did not care. All he cared about was hurting the hateful dragon. His wings had long been broken, failing to regrow, so he clutched onto the body of the dread lord with his 6 sharp legs. His giant eyes were faceted, consisting of thousands of smaller ones, and so thousands of harrowing dragons reflected in their dark surface, filling him with boundless rage. His long beak had just pierced the dread lord's flesh in the spot where a few scales had cracked, mangling it. Ugh! Sunny felt murderous joy. Bleeding and hurt by that last attack, the dragon spread its wings. His maw opened, and another melodious call escaped from it, battering the monstrous butterfly like a devastating ram. Reeling from the shockwave of the following sonic boom, Sunny felt his shell falling apart and growled, mending it. The dread lord was a step ahead, though. Before the damaged butterfly coalesced back into a stable form, he tore 2 of its legs with his fangs, then broke another with his terrifying claws. Sunny felt his grip on the odious dragon loosen. No, no, come back here, you hideous worm. Blinded by pain and driven mad by the scent of blood, he laughed. The massive body of the tenebrous butterfly rippled and then flowed, changing shape. Long tentacles shot from its carapace, wrapping themselves around the dread lord's wings and pressing them into his body. Soon, a revolting octopus-like abomination was clinging to him, tearing at his scales with a sharp beak. Sunny had no wings anymore, and the dragon could not move his. They plummeted from the sky slower than they were supposed to, considering that Kai, and by extension, the dread lord could fly even without wings, but still fast enough. The moment the two of them hit the ground, shattering a dozen buildings and sending cracks running through the carapace of the inconceivable carcass Twilight stood upon, Sunny was thrown off the body of the dreadful dragon. He rolled away, his shell already shifting. By the time the dread lord rose, a giant leopard of decaying flesh was already lunging at him, aiming to bite into his throat. Their frenzied battle continued. When they fought on the ground, Sunny assumed the form of a land predator. When the dread lord tried to rise into the sky, he assumed the form of a flying monstrosity. When the dragon threw him underwater, he turned into the onyx serpent, relentlessly attacking his loathsome enemy in the murky depths. He was crazed and relentless, but his enemy was both powerful and vicious. Even robbed of his most insidious weapon, the dread lord was still a harrowing foe. His mighty body, his sinister mind, and his profane voice were all fearsome, capable of visiting unimaginable devastation upon the world. Sunny was suffering much more than the odious dragon, his shadow incarnation receiving more and more soul damage despite being hidden inside an armored shell. But the dragon was hurting as well. Although the wounds littering his body were not deep, they were numerous, seeping with silver blood. And that was all Sunny wished for. Bleed for me, worm. There was an annoying fly trying to intervene in their battle, hovering around them and sending one arrow after another at the dread lord. That fly wanted to steal his vengeance from him, and so Sunny swiped at it with his claws, sending the pest plummeting down. It soon returned, though, drowning him in rage. Just wait a little, I'll kill you too. Everyone, he was going to kill everyone. But the dragon would be first. Even if Sunny had to rip his own soul apart to murder the loathsome worm, he would see him dead. Die, die, die. Even with nearly endless reserves of essence and the boundless fury of the king's resentment fueling him, Sunny was struggling to deal severe damage to the dread lord. He vaguely remembered that there was someone else he had to kill, a vile amalgamation of countless beings hiding in the reflections, but he couldn't even slay this winged fiend. Indignant, Sunny broke through the barrier of corpses floating in the water and slithered onto one of the carcasses. Before he could even change his shape, the harrowing dragon bit into his shell, tearing it, and dragged him into the sky. 4 sets of terrifying claws slashed at him, shattering the onyx plates of the shell and maiming his serpentine body. A hateful voice boomed in his head, making him dizzy. You have RETURNED to the source, I see. She is back too, then. Ripping into the crumbling shell with his maw, the dread lord laughed. Laughed at him. Sunny roared in fury. Shall we kill her again? Yes, I will devour her, right after I'm done with you. Nephi's, he was talking about Nephi's. Deep in the crumbling embrace of his shell, Sunny went absolutely mad. Forgetting everything else except for his rage, he allowed the shell of the onyx serpent to dissolve into a torrent of shadows and escape their embrace. Landing on the shoulder of the harrowing dragon in his fragile human form, Sunny grasped the hilt of the sin of solace and plunged it between the impregnable scales. Or at least he tried to. As if sensing the cursed blade, the dread lord finally showed a reaction. The massive body of the dragon recoiled, sending Sunny flying. He fell through the air with terrible speed, plummeting down, down. There were no shadows for him to safely land into. Before Sunny was splattered against the cold stones, someone caught him, slowing his fall. The two of them hit a stone wall and shattered it, rolling into the courtyard below. Sunny landed on something soft and bounced away. Arg! Leaning on the sin of solace, he rose and looked around with bloodshot eyes. The weathered corpses, the battlements, he knew this place. He was back in the floating fortress, where Mordred had welcomed them to twilight. So, the worm is afraid of my sword. A twisted grin appeared on his lips, and Sunny finally noticed another figure struggling to stand up from the cold stones near him. It was that annoying fly. Killing it would only take a split second. Before he could do it, though, a massive shadow covered him. Then the battered dragon landed on the wall of the fortress, crushing the battlements with his claws. With silver blood streaming down his midnight scales, the dread lord gazed down at him, starlight burning in his malevolent eyes. His gaze shifted slightly, crushing down on the annoying fly like an invisible force. Using the fact that the loathsome dragon had been distracted by the fly, Sunny considered his enemy for a moment. His mind was aflame with insatiable anger, so it was hard to think, hard to stay still and contemplate the way to kill his enemy better, even though that was his one and only goal. Somewhere deep down, Sunny knew that he had surrendered his most lethal weapon, his cunning, to the scorching temptation of wrath. But that thought, too, was obliterated by the ocean of boundless rage. That worm is strong. Sunny had called upon his most primal, most destructive power, the shadow shell. He had ravaged the dread lord as a ferocious sea serpent, a dreadful butterfly, a decaying leopard, and many more revolting shapes. His attacks had dealt some damage to the enemy, but none of them had made the dragon real. The only thing that had was the sin of solace. Sunny glanced at the beautiful jade giant. He knows that sword. The mad prince had wielded the sin of solace, and so the dread lord would be familiar with the sinister power of the cursed blade. Even if it had never been used against him, he would know and fear it. That was because while Sunny could mutilate the dragon's flesh, the sin of solace could shatter his mind. It had been created from the whisper of Ariel, the demon of dread, after all. And there was no one more familiar with the terror of Ariel's secrets than the dread lord, who was similarly burdened by the knowledge of truth due to his flaw. There was a problem, though. Sunny could only wield the sin of solace in a human hand, but his human body could be destroyed by one bellow from the dreadful dragon. Or maybe not. Grinning madly, Sunny dismissed the jade giant. At the same time, he called upon the shadows once again. They surged from the open gate of the shadow lantern, enveloping him like a dark tide. And then a towering figure rose from that tide. This time, Sunny did not create the shell of a serpent, a butterfly, or a fearsome leopard. Instead, he borrowed a page from the devouring beast's book and created the shell that was a perfect replica of himself, only on a much larger scale. Of course, he couldn't compete with the feral plague, who had stood 100 meters tall. But even at a third of her height, his head still rose above the battlements of the fortress. A furious dark giant made of shadows appeared in the middle of the courtyard, sharing Sunny's appearance. His towering body was covered by a cracked onyx armor, and a whirlwind of sparks surrounded his outstretched hand. Memories were mystical tools. They were created from the soul essence of their wielder and adjusted to suit the wielder's body. That was why Awakened did not need to fit and tailor their armor or mold the hilts of their weapons to their grip. However, things changed once an Awakened reached transcendence. The body of a saint could transform, taking an entirely different shape. It was only then that the limit to how much a memory could be adjusted to fit its wielder revealed itself. Different memories had different limits. Some could still be used by the transformed saints, some could not. Generally, the more powerful a memory was, the more flexible potential it possessed. And Sunny was willing to bet that the sin of solace, a transcendent memory of the fifth tier, possessed more than enough of it to be useful in the hands of a giant, especially because the form he had taken was only different from his own body in size, and therefore did not require the jade giant to stray away from its nature as a sword. All he had to do was pour more essence into manifesting it. 10 times more, 100 times more, 1,000 times more. It did not matter. Sunny's essence was inexhaustible right now. As the shape of a graceful sword, its blade dozens of meters long, started to manifest itself from light, Sunny grinned and dashed forward. It was going to take the sin of Solace some time to weave itself into existence, and he would have to occupy the loathsome dragon until then. Struggling to control his massive body, Sonny leaned forward and rammed his shoulder into the wall of the courtyard. The entire fortress quaked and tilted, water pouring in through the broken gates. The wall itself cracked and collapsed, forcing the dread lord who had been using it as purchase to lose balance. Before the dragon could open his massive wings, Sonny grabbed onto him and pulled him down. His face was very close to the dread lord's bloodied chest. If not for the visor of the onyx helmet, Sonny would have tried to bite into his throat. "What's this?" Something glistened amidst the silver blood. There between the midnight scales was a scale that seemed different from all the others. It was dull gray, as if forged from iron, and had a peculiar shape. Sonny tried to get a better look at it, but at that moment, he heard the annoying fly shout, Sonny, I can't." "What?" And then a radiant arrow hit him in the back, slid into the crack of the mantle, and detonated inside. "No!" The left side of the shadow giant's torso exploded from within. His onyx armor, which had already been severely damaged, crumbled into pieces. His left arm, which had almost grasped the hilt of the sin of Solace, fell to the ground. At the same time, the dragon's maw closed on his neck, shredding it. The dread lord growled, tearing the giant's head off with a terrible pull. Blinded by terrible pain and disoriented, Sonny crashed on the cold stones. His shell fell apart, and he was banished from the embrace of shadows. His body rolled and came to halt in the rubble of the shattered fortress wall. He felt cold water licking his torn skin. Ugh! The fly, he should have killed it sooner. The loathsome dragon must have whispered a command into the vermin's ear. Letting out a pained groan, Sonny forced his battered body to rise, only to see the dread lord's tail swiping at him with terrible speed. Remembering how the hollow vessels of Soul Stealer exploded into bloody mist after being struck by it, he let out a hateful scream and stepped into the shadows. A moment later, he appeared on top of the crumbling wall. From there, Sonny could see the courtyard and the figure of the bleeding dragon below him. He could also see twilight in the distance, barely visible through the haze of dawn. What to do, what to do? Belatedly, he thought about his shadows. Saint, Fiend, Nightmare. They could help him a lot in this battle, especially Saint, who was immune to all mind attacks and could resist the authority of the dread lord. But thinking about them filled him with endless fury. No one was allowed to steal his vengeance from him. No one. Summoning the shadows would only give them a chance to kill the odious dragon before he could. He would never allow that to happen. This is madness. A feeble thought was drowned by the torrent of bloodlust and demented anger. Sonny was not going to allow anyone to steal his victims. No, if he summoned the shadows, it would only be to kill them. Kill them all. In fact, it was exactly what he should have done. Each of them was a shadow creature, and a powerful one at that, suitable to become fuel for his soul. He had painstakingly nurtured them himself, after all. So, wasn't it only right for him to reap what he had sown? Just imagining the flood of shadow fragments he would receive from slaughtering his servants made Sonny smile viciously. Was that how the Mad Prince had become a titan? It had to be. Where else would the vile madman find enough fragments to form the seventh core, here in the tomb of Ariel? Sonny would be wise to follow his example. But first, he had to kill the dragon. And the traitorous fly. Turning his head to look at his enemies, Sonny lingered for a split second. Out there far away, wasn't something strange happening in twilight? Suddenly frozen, he looked into the distance. On the crumbling streets of twilight, a grotesque nightmare creature was mauling another with its fangs, while a rain of swords and spears fell on its tough hide. Each strike caused streams of fetid blood to pour out of ghastly wounds, but the abominations paid it no attention. "Ah, it hurts," Mordred, who had taken the body of the nightmare creature, was not having a great time. Not only was he being cut and mangled by the vessels of the impostor, but it was also getting hard to breathe. The air was full of smoke, and the buildings around him had caught fire at some point. But he was so close. Finally, the abominations he had been brutalizing shuddered and died. An ethereal stream of power flowed into his soul, and he fled into the reflections, escaping the cruel blades of the hollow vessels. Appearing a few hundred meters away from the pursuing mob, he left the dying body of the battered nightmare creature and returned to his own. Before too long, a familiar pain tore apart his soul, forcing Mordred to groan. Why does it have to be so unpleasant? A new core was being born in the depths of his soul. He was becoming a monster once again. This will give me some breathing room. The human flood was already surrounding him, seemingly endless. Mordred had only a few seconds of reprieve before the puppets of Soul Stealer would assault him again. His perception spread far and wide, jumping between countless reflections to observe the world. He saw Song of the Fallen, the blind witch. He also saw a giant made of shadows wield a jade sword against a harrowing dragon, Sunless. The madman was fighting against the Dread Lord. Nightingale was there as well, kneeling near a puddle of water. At that moment, Mordred's eyes glistened, and a sinister thought entered his mind. Can I? He hesitated for a moment, unsure, but then a dark smile twisted his lips. Well, even if I fail, it will at least be entertaining. Mordred moved, contemplating how much essence he had left. Reaching the distant fortress would be a challenge. But then he was distracted from these calculations. That was because he saw something else. Turning toward the heart of the city, Mordred froze for a moment. His eyes widened slightly. Cassie leaned against a broken wall, clutching her mangled neck. Her armor was slick with blood, and she felt weak. Her beautiful face was pale and tired. Go! The echo of the slain Sibyl floated away, the hem of her red dress hovering above the cobblestones. She was going to buy her master some time to escape, and then drown in the flood of hollow-eyed warriors. Sighing, Cassie pushed herself off the wall and continued to flee. She dodged and evaded the nightmare creatures that lunged at her from the ruins, not bothering to retaliate. There was no time for it. The lives of Effie and Jet were hanging in a fragile balance. They were literally hanging from her neck, hidden in an iron locket. That locket pressed her down with the weight of a mountain. She couldn't allow herself to make mistakes. I must escape. Making another turn, she came to a halt in front of a devastated space. Behind her was the tide of pursuing warriors, all staring at her with those eerie, empty eyes of theirs. In front of her were the broken gates of twilight. Beyond them there was nothing but still water. There was nowhere else to run. Cassie let out a quiet sigh. Turning around, she lowered her bloodied hand and unsheathed the quiet dancer. The slender rapier glistened in the light of dawn, pointing at the approaching puppets of Soul Stealer. She gritted her teeth. Come then. It's time. In the heart of twilight, Nephi's finally reached the Serpent King's palace. The palace was no more. It had collapsed at some point, turning into a vast ruin. Blood flowed between the shattered stones. The Dread Lord was not here. Sunny was nowhere to be seen either. She was late. A heavy sigh escaped from her lips. Behind Nephi's, twilight was wreathed in white flames. In front of her, a dozen warriors stood motionlessly, surrounding a monstrous figure in a tattered vermilion cloak. If not for his mirror-like eyes, she would not have recognized Mordred of Valor, Soul Stealer, his original body. Nephi stared at the monster silently, an incandescent void shining through her eyes. Then she took a step forward. Her armor had long crumbled. Her white tunic was torn and cut, revealing the soft radiance of her skin. Even her sword was covered by a net of cracks, ready to shatter into a whirlwind of sparks. She was tired. Found you. Nephi's walked towards Soul Stealer, and the figures surrounding him moved to meet her. At the same time, thousands upon thousands of human vessels were pouring from the burning streets, surrounding her. There was no end to them. She had killed so many, but no matter how many she killed, the flood of bodies never ceased. It only grew. The first figure reached her, summoning a long spear. Nephi's raised her sword and met its strike. The second figure was already lunging from the side of the third, the fourth. She tried to block, evade, and deflect them all. A few moments later, her sword broke. Even then, Nephi's continued to move forward. Step after step, wound after wound, she slowly, tortuously made her way towards Soul Stealer. She almost made it. There were only a few meters left between her and the monstrous creature now, but those several meters were like an insurmountable abyss. Pushed down, Nephi's fell to her knees. 7 spears were piercing her radiant body, nailing it to the ground. She couldn't heal these wounds until the spears were gone, but those holding them had no intention of retrieving their weapons. Impaled on them and held down, Nephi's couldn't move. Sensing a movement ahead, she raised her head and looked at the approaching monster. Her radiant image was reflected in his mirror-like eyes. Soul Stealer stopped a couple steps away, looking down at her with an empty gaze. His pale lips twisted into a strange smile. Sister. His inhuman voice sounded like shards of broken glass. Nephi's looked down. The radiance suffusing her skin dimmed a little. A tormented sigh escaped from her lips. Kneeling, just like she had at the end of the second nightmare, Nephi said, "I came into this world as a sharp blade." She raised her head slightly and looked at the monstrous creature with a tired gaze. "But with every step I took, my edge was dulled." Her face slowly became impassive, devoid of all emotion. Her voice was like a whisper. "I've made compromises, learned how to act reasonably, and forced myself to move with restraint." Nephi's took a deep breath and remained silent for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had grown steady and loud. A hint of an indescribable emotion appeared in her radiant eyes. Glaring at the monstrous creature, she said, "I am tired of compromises. I am tired of being reasonable. I am tired of being restrained." Nephi's looked into the eyes of Soul Stealer, furious flames igniting in the depths of her own. "I am changing star of the immortal Flame Clan." Her gaze was suddenly full of cold contempt. Her even tone trembled with incinerating passion. "Who dares to stop me?" And when she spoke those words, the soft radiance suffusing her skin exploded with brilliant light. A hurricane wind rose, stirring the fire devouring the streets of twilight. The 7 spears impaling Nephi's to the ground caught aflame, melting in its scorching white heat. Although it seemed impossible, the blinding light emanating from her incandescent figure grew even more intense, unbearable to look at. If Sunny was there to see Nephi's, he would have witnessed her 6 radiant soul cores swelling with furious light. He would have also seen one of them becoming covered by a net of fiery cracks. Soul Stealer moved, reaching forward, but he was too late. In the next moment, all the flames burning across the ruins of twilight were suddenly absorbed by the incandescent figure kneeling in front of him. For a split second, the world was still and silent. There was a whisper, and then everything dissolved in white radiance. Standing on the crumbling wall of the floating fortress, Sunny saw the light grow dim above twilight. For a moment, everything was still. And then, the entire world was suddenly drowned in white radiance, blinding him. Stunned, he raised a hand to cover his eyes and saw a pristine star ignite in the heart of the distant city. It swelled, growing into a massive sphere of furious flame. Everything happened in an instant. The buildings nearest to the white star simply dissolved in its pure light, evaporating. Those further away exploded into dust and were erased from existence by an obliterating shockwave. Those behind them were flattened and melted, turning to ash from the immolating heat. A wave of incinerating fire, taller than the towering walls of the city, spread outward at lightning speed, consuming everything in its path: buildings, trees, cobblestones, even air itself, and all the tiny human figures flooding the crumbling streets. Behind it, the furious star rose and deformed, slowly turning into a mushroom cloud of incandescent white flame. The pillar of fire supporting it dwarfed everything, reaching toward the sky. What? Even driven into madness by fury, he was momentarily paralyzed by the harrowing splendor of that inconceivable sight. Twilight. Twilight was being destroyed in front of his eyes. That was when the invisible shockwave reached the fortress, shattering its walls and throwing him down. The deafening roar of the explosion came next, shaking the world. Sonny plummeted from the broken wall and hit the cold stones with a sickening sound. Bouncing off the hard surface, he rolled and then instinctively covered his head with his hands. In the next moment, a rain of stone debris fell down, pummeling him like crushing hail. Who dares? Deaf from the cataclysmic roar of the blast, he screamed furiously and tried to stand up. Something hit him on the head, but Sonny did not care. Hunched, he rose from the ground and peered into the dust that had enveloped everything around, searching for the massive figure of the dragon. So what if all of Twilight was devoured by flame? So what if it seemed like the sky had been shattered and fell down? He was still going to kill the hateful worm. Why is it so dark? The colossal pillar of flame had reached the heavens and collapsed on itself, torn apart by the wind. The furious light of the pure white star had dimmed and disappeared, plunging the world into darkness. A vast cloud of ash rose into the air and obscured the seven suns, turning the twilight of dawn into a lightless gloom of dark devastation. Far away, in the scorched desert that had been twilight, ash fell from the sky like snow. In the heart of the ruined city, nothing but darkness remained. Even the air itself had been burned away by the inconceivable heat of the obliterating explosion, and so there were no flames burning on the blackened stones. The only source of illumination in that dark abyss was a radiant figure that stood amidst the destruction, surrounded by ash and ruins. It was slowly coalescing back into the shape of a beautiful young woman from pure light. Her brilliant skin did not have a single blemish on it, and her shining hair flowed like incandescent silver, emanating a blinding white radiance. Her pristine light reflected in the boiling water, creating a small island of light in the sea of searing darkness. Twilight was still and silent, with nothing but water moving on its vast, smoldering expanse. The numerous human bodies of Soul Stealer were all gone, devoured by the merciless flames and turned to ash. The nightmare creatures who had battled against them were gone, too. Only Nephi's remained, illuminating the darkness with her light. And because she was the only one left, the indestructible reflection of the sinister mirror fiend had nowhere to go but into the depths of her radiant, harrowing eyes. Nephi's was standing on the surface of a calm ocean. The world around her was suffused with sunlight, and the perfectly still water below her bare feet glowed beautifully, reflecting the brilliance of heaven. It was as if she was standing on a sea of golden clouds, awash in breathtaking light. Seven suns shone brightly above her head. She looked at them impassively. She had felt the terrible agony of one of her soul cores, the terror core, destroying itself before. But so many defiled abominations had been consumed by the unleashed flames of her soul that it was reformed anew. With it, the seventh core was born. The last core. The pain of its creation had already passed, and Nephi's was a titan now. She looked away from the seven suns and gazed silently at the only spot of dirt and darkness in her perfectly radiant world. Out there, some distance away, a repulsive creature stood, staring at her with mirror-like eyes. It did not look like a human, nor did it look like a nightmare creature. Instead, it was like a revolting amalgamation of countless people, countless abominations, all joined together into a monstrous patchwork being that shifted and changed form with every move, every breath, every moment that passes. The shifting monster towered above her, staining the pure waters of her soul with darkness and corruption. Soul Stealer grinned, reaching forward with countless hands. He called her name with countless voices. His countless eyes festered with hatred and greed, but also fear. Nephi's looked at him with contempt. Her even voice echoed across the radiant expanse, uttering a single word. A burn. And then the beautiful landscape of her soul changed. The water Soul Stealer stood upon was no water at all. Instead, it was liquid flame, as if he was standing on the surface of a furious white star. The golden clouds floating above him were not vapor, but incandescent gas, as if he was drowning in burning stardust. Most harrowing of all, though, was the light of the seven suns. Because here in the sea of changing stars' soul, there was no escape from their incinerating rays. The radiance of the seven suns swelled, turning the calm ocean into an incandescent white void. And trapped in that merciless void, Soul Stealer burned. The floor of the floating fortress was tilted, and Sunny could hear the sound of water rushing into the breaches. His sight was obstructed by the cloud of dust, so he closed his eyes and sensed a massive figure stirring in the darkness. He grinned, forgetting about how torn and battered his body was. Looking up, Sunny saw two cold silver stars burning in the darkness high above him, the eyes of the murderous dragon, gazing down upon him. The dragon moved, and at the same time, the shadows moved as well. The drowning fortress shuddered. Slumped near a puddle of water, Kai gasped for air. He was suffering from terrible pain and struggling to breathe. That blow Sunny had delivered him before was not a light one. He suspected that several of his ribs had been cracked or broken. His muscles were torn as well, so drawing the bow was a torment. This really is a nightmare. More than anything, Kai felt lost and confused. The battle the government forces were supposed to observe had already been a disaster. The terrible journey through the merciless white desert was like a feverish dream. Before he knew it, they were standing in front of a towering block of black stone, preparing to enter a seed of nightmare. Kai had thought that he had prepared himself mentally for the dreadful trial of the spell, but he had been wrong. Coming to his senses in the dim throne room of a mysterious palace was unlike anything he had ever expected, and much more terrible. Sunny was there, pulling him away from the falling debris. He heard some outlandish things about an evil dragon, who was also his twin, and an army of alien warriors that were supposed to help the cohort. A few moments later, the dark dragon was in front of them, commanding them to kneel. Kai knew that Sunny never lied, of course, but hearing that voice and feeling the irresistible authority contained within it, he fully realized that it was all true. The abominable dragon was, indeed, a copy of him, a much more powerful, vile, and corrupted version of Kai, who had betrayed his friends and was now trying to kill them. How could he turn on Sunny, Effie, Cassie, Nephi's, and Colonel Jet? Kai did not know, but the truth was undeniable. Learning that truth hurt much more than having his ribs broken. Things had moved very fast from that point, not giving him an opportunity to process the bitter revelations and make sense of what was happening. Sunny warned him to stay away and suddenly turned into a giant serpent, attacking the dragon furiously. Had his friend somehow become a saint already? Kai did not know. Why did he have to stay away? He did not know that either. There were many things Kai did not understand, but then there was no real need to. At the core of it, the situation was clear. The cohort was up against a dreadful foe, and the lives of his friends were hanging in balance. That was why Kai tried to help Sunny fight the dragon, as best he could. The three of them rose into the sky, and he saw a strange city built on a vast island, illuminated by the light of 7 rising suns. The streets of the city were flooded with people. Those people were fighting against a legion of nightmare creatures, but somehow seemed more sinister than the abominations they fought. Kai only caught a glimpse of them, though, engrossed by the battle against the vile dragon against himself. Sunny seemed to have lost his mind, for some reason, shifting between the forms of various harrowing creatures. Consumed by fury, he wasn't able to differentiate between friend and foe. That was how Kai ended up being battered and suffering grievous wounds from his own friend. He should have listened to Sunny's warning better. But even if he had, he wouldn't have left Sunny to fight against the abominable dragon alone. Eventually, the three of them ended up away from the city, across the vast expanse of water littered with dreadful corpses, in the ruins of a fallen fortress. There was a bright flash and the deafening roar of a distant explosion. And now, Kai was surrounded by darkness. Cold water was licking his skin. Ugh. Using his awakened ability, Kai could see through the darkness. He could also see through the billowing dust and even through the stone debris. All around him, the world had gone mad. The shadows were surging, turning into numerous dark hands. Those hands, each possessing 7 fingers, tore at the dreadful dragon with sharp claws. At the same time, Sunny was trying to build another giant around himself, his attempts failing time after time. The dragon seemed wary of the enormous white sword that lay on the cold stones, partially buried in rubble, and so destroyed the giant ruthlessly, each time, before it could take shape. Slowly but surely, Sunny's body became tattered and broken. Even though he did not bleed, Kai could see that his condition was deteriorating swiftly. Sunny did not seem to care, consumed by the strange derangement, but Kai did. I have to do something. Even though Kai was not as powerful as his friends, he was not at all weak. He was an ascended, too. He had led soldiers into battle and killed dreadful nightmare creatures, survived impossible odds, and triumphed where most other people would have perished. He had burned alive in the dragon's flame, and lived to slay the dragon. The problem was that Kai could not really move. His head was full of dreadful whispers, and the remnant will of the abominable dragon was forcing him to do things he never wanted to do. Simply resisting that call was taking all of his strength, and that was with the dragon not paying him any attention as well. His thoughts were not his own. Betrayed you, poisoned you, made you into an abomination, lured you, abandoned you, traitor, traitor, traitor. Kai groaned and grabbed his head, but the whispers only grew louder. The worst part about them was that, because of his flaw, Kai knew that it was all true. The other he had indeed been betrayed, corrupted, used, and abandoned. By none other than Sunny, the person he trusted the most. The other Sunny, perhaps. At least that was what the dragon believed. Hurt him, kill him, punish him, take his hope away, take his will away, take his crown away. Kai gritted his teeth, refusing to listen. He knew himself very well. That wasn't him. That wasn't them. Luckily, Sunny was attacking the dragon so fiercely that it had no time to turn its gaze at Kai. And so, the insurmountable authority of its command was slowly growing weaker. Groaning, Kai turned to the puddle of water and looked at the one who was hiding in the reflections. His lips moved. Be ready. With that, he slowly picked up his bow and raised it with trembling hands. His bow was a transcendent memory of the 5th tier, and there were plenty of enchanted arrows in his soul arsenal. The problem was that, despite that, Kai had failed to deal substantial damage to the abominable dragon. Ironically, the most damage he had dealt was to the shadow giant Sunny created just before the explosion. However, with his supernatural sight, Kai had long noticed a special scale hidden on the dragon's chest. It was of a different color than all others, as if forged from iron and had a peculiar shape. Looking down, he looked at the iron amulet in the shape of an anvil hanging from a string on his neck. That amulet had been with him since the second nightmare, given to him by Sunny. And so, his evil copy must have possessed it as well. Ignoring the pain, Kai gritted his teeth and rose, then strained his muscles and drew his bow. The string was heavy. One shot. Sunny seemed to be moments away from death, so there would be no time for another. He couldn't miss. He wouldn't miss. Silencing the deafening whispers that drowned his mind, Kai did what he was best at, aimed his bow, held his breath, and allowed his fingers to slip from the string. A sinister red arrow flashed through the darkness and hit the small iron scale, hidden among countless others on the chest of the lunging dragon. The dragon's claws tore through the forming shadow giant and struck Sunny, pressing him into the ground. The arrow failed to pierce the creature's tough hide, and so Kai swayed, suddenly weak from blood loss. But it did break that single scale, cracking it in two. In the next moment, the man hiding in the reflection was suddenly gone, and the dragon froze in place. Something sinister reflected in the depths of his silver eyes. What a sight! Mordred watched as Nightingale, picturesque despite being bloodied and covered in dust, drew his bow and let an arrow loose. He had fled to the floating fortress after noticing the denial amulet fused into the Dread Lord's scales, and just in time. Something truly curious had happened in twilight, destroying all the reflections he could have used to take a look. It was probably Changing Star's fault, or Soul Stealer's fault. In any case, Mordred would have been burned to a crisp if he had not left the city. After traversing the still water and reaching the fortress, he hid in the reflections and observed what was happening inside. Sunless was fighting like a madman, more of a madman than he usually was, while the Dread Lord viciously mauled and battered him. Truly, it was a miracle that Sunless had been able to battle the Tyrant of Verge for so long, and even deliver countless wounds to the mighty dragon. What other master could have done the same? That guy really boggled the mind. Nevertheless, there was something strange about their fight. The defiled saint could have gone for the kill a long time ago, but he was restraining himself, probably because he wanted to capture Sunless alive and make him a slave again. That made sense. Although Mordred mostly knew about the 6 plagues from the records he had spied in the frozen reflection of twilight, the Mad Prince seemed to have been the deterrence the Tyrant of Verge used to keep the other 5 defiled champions in check, especially Soul Stealer. Now that Soul Stealer had finally turned on him, Sunless and his sinister soul were the best weapon the Dread Lord could use against the rebellious fiend. Mordred studied Nightingale for a while, amused. Have I really submitted to that naive fool? Well, he must not have remained naive for long after becoming defiled. Still, how had Soul Stealer missed the chance to become the master of the Mad Prince himself after Changing Star was gone? The impostor was really a disappointment. Regardless, Mordred had spoken to the Nightingale, the original carrier of the Denial Amulet, just before twilight went up in flames. The charming archer had a part to play, and now it seemed that he had played it brilliantly. A red arrow whistled through the air and struck the small scale on the chest of the giant dragon, cracking it. What a shot! How hard would it be to hit a target so small and a moving one at that? Mordred allowed himself to admire the precision of the ascended archer for a split second, and then dove into the Dread Lord's corrupted soul. Here we go. Smiling, Mordred found himself surrounded by darkness. The darkness extended its revolting tendrils, trying to catch him. A forest of them rose from all sides, slithering like snakes. Trembling slightly, he evaded the grasp of corruption and dashed forward. That's why I hate invading the souls of nightmare creatures. At least he possessed both of his hands here. Sadly, Mordred could only reflect the powers and weapons of the master of the invaded soul, not use his own. And since the Dread Lord had surrendered to defilement and was thus banished from the nightmare spell, there were no memories here for Mordred to summon. The memories were given by the spell and taken away by the spell. There were other things he could steal, though. Almost caught by the harrowing tendrils, he jumped and soared into the air. Flying was not something Mordred did often, but he had experienced it before, so learning how to use this particular ability only took him a moment. His body rippled and swelled, becoming covered by impregnable scales. Two mighty wings sprouted from his back, and his teeth turned into sharp porcelain fangs. He became a dragon. Mordred had not been a dragon before, but he had stolen bodies of nightmare creatures of a similar kind. So he grew accustomed to this new shape quickly. Finally, his eerie gaze pierced the vile darkness and found a figure standing in the heart of it, lonesome and lost. The soul of the Dread Lord still maintained its human appearance. He must not have surrendered to corruption entirely, yet. A vicious smile twisted Mordred's reptilian lips. Time to die. He wasn't sure which one of them was going to die, but was eager to find out. Mordred was merely an ascended monster right now, while the Dread Lord, there were 5 repugnant masses of corruption hidden in the boundless darkness of his defiled soul, so he had to be a corrupted tyrant. The chances of victory were slim. But then again, Mordred had killed numerous foes who were more powerful than him, more experienced than him, more knowledgeable about the nuances of their aspects than him, more proficient in using their memories than him. However, none of them had been as resourceful as him, as resolute as him, or as ruthless as him. Nightingale was a brave, but naive fool, so how much better could his corrupted version be? If there was one thing Mordred was afraid of, though, it was the knowledge of the defilement the Dread Lord wielded. That was why this battle was a gamble, even more so than every other soul battle Mordred had fought in the past. I'll just have to kill him before he has time to say anything then. In the distance, the lonesome figure moved, finally noticing the invader. A mad light ignited in the Dread Lord's eyes. Far away, among the scorched ruins of twilight, nothing living moved. The buildings, those that were far enough from the epicenter of the blast to not be reduced to dust, had either collapsed or stood blackened and deformed. Ash fell from the dark sky like snow, covering the desolate landscape. Most of the living beings that had witnessed the birth of the radiant star had been turned to ash, but piles of smoldering corpses still remained at the edges of the city. The walls surrounding Twilight had collapsed, and the giant carcasses beyond them were scorched. A pale hand rose from the water among those carcasses. Surfacing, Cassie climbed onto the carapace of a dead abomination and gulped for air. Then, she collapsed and lay motionlessly, ash falling on her face from the dark sky. The iron locket was still with her, safe and sound. A slender rapier hovered in the air above the blind girl, seemingly concerned. Cassie concentrated on it, feeling her consciousness begin to slip. Go! The quiet dancer hesitated for a few moments, then disappeared into the darkness. Cassie sighed and allowed her battered body to relax. Laying on the blackened carapace of a dead abomination, she turned her head to face the ruins of Twilight. A cold, pale smile appeared on her lips. In the heart of the destroyed city, Nephi slowly opened her eyes. Soul Stealer was no more. The bright radiance suffusing her skin slowly grew dim and disappeared. The white flames dancing in her eyes were extinguished. Her silver hair, which had been flowing in an ethereal wind, fell down. Standing naked amidst the scene of utter devastation, she shivered and looked around. Her mind was empty. After a while, Nephi realized that her tunic had been destroyed and summoned another memory. The familiar weight of the Starlight Legion armor, The only one she had left settled on her shoulders, making her feel comforted. That armor. It felt as if she was forgetting something. Twilight Soul Stealer, the Dread Lord. As she remained motionless, considering her thoughts, a slender rapier fell from the dark sky and hovered in front of her, trembling slightly. Nephise looked at it impassively. The rapier turned, its tip pointing into the darkness. "You want to lead me somewhere?" Quiet dancer, that was Cassie's echo. The rapier trembled again, and then flew forward. Frowning slightly, Nephise followed. In the courtyard of the drowning fortress, a harrowing dragon growled and took a step back, its massive body shuddering. His silver eyes had lost their sinister light, turning glossy and unfocused. A vicious battle must have been taking place in the dragon's corrupted soul. The maddening whispers thundering in Kai's head finally grew silent. He swayed, then took a labored breath and limped toward Sunny. His friend was laying on the cold stones, barely alive. His body was a terrible painting of torn flesh, white bones visible through its mangled mess. Eerily, he was still not bleeding at all. Usually, Kai would have been reassured by that fact, but right now it looked like Sunny was already a cold corpse. But he wasn't a corpse. Sunny was still moving, struggling to stand up. Even after battling a defiled saint tooth and nail, he was still unbroken, trying to continue to fight. As Kai approached, he heard his furious whispers. "Kill you, I'll kill you, shut up, I'll tear you apart." Strangely enough, his hateful gaze was not directed at the archer. Instead, Sunny was glaring past him, seemingly at an empty spot. Kai felt his heart tighten. What is happening to him? Sunny had always had a wild personality, and there was that time he had turned a little feral in the dark city, but he was never truly mad. Now, however, it seemed as though his friend had entirely lost his mind. There must be a reason. He had warned Kai to stay away before, had he not? That meant that this strange condition Sunny was in had a purpose. To resist the authority of the Dread Lord, most likely, somehow. It had to be a part of some cunning scheme. He would deal with it later. For now, Kai had a more serious problem to solve. The abominable dragon was still alive, and while that man, Mordred, seemed confident in himself, there was no telling who would prevail in their dire fight. The result would be clear in seconds. But Kai looked at the dragon with a lost expression. The Dread Lord. Mordred, both of them were monsters. He still remembered what the scion of the great clan Valor had done in the second nightmare. The harrowing massacre he had perpetrated in the Kingdom of Hope was not something a sane person would ever commit. Even if he did win, was it really fine to let the dreadful authority of Kai's voice fall into the hands of someone so depraved? "Wait a little more, Sunny. I'll come back for you soon." Turning away from his friend, Kai gritted his teeth and pushed himself off the ground. Soaring into the air, he strained his core muscles to draw the string of his bow, and at the same time, summoned the sharpest arrow he had in store. That one was not capable of producing devastating blasts or robbing nightmare creatures of their strength. Its enchantment was rather simple. It burrowed much deeper than other arrows would, piercing flesh and bone like butter. The drawback was that the arrow was flimsy and fragile. It was disobedient and slow, too, so hitting anything with it was a tough task. More than that, its tip would shatter against any kind of armor, therefore, it wasn't easy to make use of the insidious enchantment. But now that the abominable dragon was nearly paralyzed by the battle happening within its soul, Kai had a chance. Of course, the battle could end at any moment. It could even end right now, leaving him defenseless in front of the terrifying dragon. Nevertheless, he brought himself right to the dragon's maw and looked into the dragon's silver eyes. Then Kai activated his ascended ability and uttered a command. He wasn't addressing the Dread Lord, however. He was addressing himself. "Kill him." Suddenly, a fierce strength filled his broken body, and a cold, frightening will flooded his mind. Raising his bow, Kai aimed carefully, and sent an arrow flying straight through the dread lord's radiant eye. The distance was too short for it to stray off course, and there was no armor in the way to make the tip break. The insidious arrow slid into the dragon's eye, pierced through it, and burrowed deep into the creature's brain. It had been shot from a transcendent bow of the 5th tier by the hand of a master, and so the havoc it wreaked inside the dread lord's head was truly gruesome. His body had been battered in the battle against Sunny, and his soul had been weakened by the battle against Mordred of Valor. The dragon shuddered and let out a terrible groan. Blasted by that groan, Kai was thrown back and crashed into the pile of stone rubble far below. Above him the dread lord convulsed, a fountain of silver blood shooting from his open maw. His head drew an arc in the air. And then the mighty dragon toppled and fell heavily to the ground, his silver eyes growing dim. This time forever. Barely conscious, Kai heard the spell whisper into his ear. You have slain a corrupted tyrant, hideous ruler of the empty sky. You have. Consumed by pain, he didn't hear the rest. He did, however, hear a terrible scream. Turning his head, Kai saw a human figure rolling on the ground in agony. It was Mordred, the scion of valor, missing a hand and covered in blood. There was something terribly wrong with that lunatic, though. His face, which had seemed to be incapable of showing earnest emotions, was now twisted by a terrible grimace, an eerie darkness devouring his eyes. Letting out a stifled groan, Mordred clutched at the stones and crawled to the nearby puddle. Reaching it, he thrust his hand into the water, into his own reflection, and tore something from within his chest, then threw it away. The thing looked like a soul shard, a piece of a mirror. Hitting the ground, the mirror shard suddenly rippled and turned into a vague figure. That figure then turned into a perfect copy of Mordred. A reflection, created by ripping one of his cores out of his soul. There was something terribly wrong with that reflection, though. As Kai watched, stunned, the visage of Mordred was twisted and deformed, tendrils of vile darkness sprouting from within it. The ghastly creature suddenly looked incredibly threatening and sinister, a frenzied smile blooming on its bloodied lips. It was as though he was watching a seed of corruption bloom, turning the human into a nightmare creature right in front of his eyes. Still on the ground, Mordred whispered a quiet curse. Ah, that was truly unpleasant. He did not look capable of fighting the defiled reflection, though, in that wretched state. Kai was laying in the rubble, his body broken and mangled, so he was not much better. Sunny was still wreathing on the ground, trying to stand up, but he was the most corpse-like of them three. I must protect him. Kai tried to move, but a surge of pain sent him crashing back down on the sharp stones. A short yelp escaped from his lips. With unwanted tears in his eyes, he looked up and saw the vile reflection walking toward his friend. Its missing hand had sprouted terrible glass claws, and its jaw was unhinged, twisted fangs growing through the mangled flesh. No! Before the creature could reach Sunny, though, a slender rapier pierced its chest, and a radiant hand grasped its head. In the next moment, the reflection was illuminated from inside by a pure white light. Smoke rose from its open mouth and charred holes where its eyes had been just a moment ago, filling the air with the revolting stench of burned flesh. Then a net of cracks covered the creature's body, and it shattered like a glass sculpture. Behind it, the figure of Changing Star was revealed, looking down with an emotionless expression. Sparks of pure white flame danced in her cold gray eyes, and she somehow seemed both the same and different from the last time Kai had seen her, back in the nightmare desert. Turning her head slightly, Nephi's looked at the corpse of the harrowing dragon and remained motionless for a few moments. Then she said, her voice strangely devoid of feeling, "We won." Soon enough, the wind carried the clouds of ash away. Twilight was once again illuminated by the beautiful light of dawn, what was left of twilight at least. The floating fortress, where the dread lord had died, broke apart and drowned in the still water. The water itself was starting to move, sparkling in the sunlight. Now that the Serpent King's city and whatever enchantments had held it in place were destroyed, the current was slowly returning. Soon enough, the current would carry it all, the blackened ruins of Twilight, the corpses of the defiled that had stormed it, and the broken ships of its fallen defenders to the edge, then throw them into the lightless abyss that lay beyond it, where they would never be found or seen again, unless someone braved the void and reached the very bottom of Ariel's dreadful world, erasing all signs that Twilight had ever existed from the endlessly flowing surface of the great river. Until the next cycle came. Hopefully, Sunny would not be there to witness it. The cohort had returned aboard the chain breaker before the fortress drowned. Now, they were observing the charred carcass of the inconceivable abomination that had served as the foundation of Twilight slowly crumbling and submerging underwater. The brilliant explosion had put a net of cracks into it, and now, the weight of the immense carapace and the water pressure were slowly pulling it apart. Well, some of them were observing. Some were in no condition to pay it much attention, if any at all. Cassie was still unconscious. Her wounds, including the deep gash on her neck, had been healed by Nephi's, but the blind girl was showing no signs of waking up yet. Surviving the mayhem and the obliterating blast must have taken a toll on her. Nephi's herself was sitting at the stern of the flying vessel, staring into the distance with a detached look on her face. She was utterly exhausted, but also this was her usual state after overusing her aspect. It was as if her humanity had been burned away and needed time to restore itself. Somehow, Sunny felt that this time, that process would take longer than it had in the past. Which was understandable. He already realized that the devastating explosion that destroyed the city and turned every living being on its streets to ash had been somehow caused by Nephi's. Sunny did not know the details, but could see that she was a Titan now. That had to be the result of her fires consuming all the nightmare creatures that had been fighting against Soul Stealer, and then killing the Mirror Fiend himself. Neph's half-breed, innate ability granted her a portion of the soul fragments of all beings killed by her flames, after all. He himself was in no mood to observe the collapse of Twilight either. Slumped against the trunk of the sacred tree, Sunny was not much different from Nephi's. Using the king's resentment had taken a toll on him, making him feel utterly drained and exhausted. His gaze was distant, and his face was pale from fatigue. There was also a confusing storm of emotions raging in his heart, but at the same time, he was too numb to deal with that mess. For now, he was simply happy to be alive, happy that all of them were alive, while their enemies, against all odds, were dead. Saint, Fiend, and Nightmare were guarding the ship and keeping an eye on Mordred in case the bastard decided to do something malicious. However, the Prince of Nothing did not seem inclined to turn on his allies, at least not just yet. He walked around the chain breaker, looking curiously at this and that. That would have infuriated Sunny if he wasn't feeling so drained. What was that guy so curious about? He had already seen everything there was to see here, hiding in their eyes on the way to the second nightmare. Perhaps looking at things through someone else's eyes and doing it yourself was not quite the same. Right. Perhaps this chain breaker was not the same as the real chain breaker they had left in the real world either. In any case, Mordred was not a problem for now, which left only Effie, Jet, and Kai. The first two had been spared from participating in the battle for Twilight. Cassie had apparently saved them from being taken by Soul Stealer with the help of the Black Beast locket, and then carried the locket out of the city before the obliterating blast. Kai, meanwhile, was full of questions, but too polite to ask them all at once. The poor guy must have been utterly confused out of all of them. The start of his nightmare was perhaps the most dreadful. As a result, the three were standing at the railings, looking at the blackened corpse of Twilight and talking quietly between themselves. Kai's expression constantly changed between stunned, expressionless, and mortified. Look at him emoting so much. Wait, he was the one who killed the Dread Lord, wasn't he? Damn. If I had a credit for every time Kai killed a dragon, I would have 2 credits now. Strange. Sunny studied the face of his friend for a few minutes, considering if he had to apologize for trying to kill him. Kai had blown up his shadow shell too, so they were probably even. In any case, this dilemma seemed too tiring and complicated to consider right now. Looking away, Sunny turned his full attention to the wood grain of the chain breaker's deck. Everything had gone wrong in Twilight. He had failed, but also prevailed in a sense. Soul Stealer was dead. The Dread Lord was dead too. The army they had hoped to recruit was dead as well. And Nephis had used the Shadow Bond to cure Sunny from madness, but still, she had broken her promise. Again. And saved him again. What a mess. Tired and confused, he closed his eyes and lowered his head to the root of the sacred tree. He just wanted to sleep. The problems, messy as they were, could wait until tomorrow. By the time Sunny woke up, it was night. Even this place of endless dawn had a night, just like the crimson expanse of eternal dusk had one. However, nights were short and fleeting at the edges of the great river. Before he knew it, the 7 suns were already rising again. The world became painted by the soft colors of the breaking dawn. With a sigh, Sunny rubbed his eyes and sat up. He felt strangely great. His body was in perfect shape because of Neph's healing flames, and his mental energy had been restored with the help of the Shroud of Dusk after having a good sleep. Nightmare had also guarded his dreams, as well as the dreams of everyone else aboard the chain breaker. Here in the pyramid built by the Demon of Dread, that alone was more important than one would think. Great. Nevertheless, his good mood was diminished when he remembered what had transpired in Twilight. I should probably be happy, right? Beyond himself even. And he was, to an extent. 2 of the most dangerous enemies there were in the tomb of Ariel had been slain, so why wouldn't he? Finally, the end of this nightmare did not seem so distant as to be impossible anymore. Salvation was within reach, already visible far in the distance, just like the first rays of the rising suns were, shining from beyond the horizon to break the reign of night. But Sunny couldn't feel completely happy. That victory of theirs had been too perilous, almost turning into defeat. In fact, it should have been a defeat, if not for a couple miracles. Other than that, he was not happy with himself personally. Sunny had accomplished a few astonishing feats during the battle for Twilight. True, reaching the throne room of the Serpent King's palace, lifting the curse of frozen time, resisting the authority of the Dread Lord, fighting the defiled saint almost to a standstill while being inhabited by madness, and even realizing the full potential of his current level of mastery over Shadow Dance. What other master could boast that they were not only capable of transforming themselves akin to a saint, but were also not limited to a single static form, turning into monstrous serpents, winged horrors, and dreadful beasts? Truly, the depth of his divine aspect was slowly starting to put the entire hierarchy of Awakened under question. Most of the things Sunny had done yesterday, nobody else could have accomplished, and without him there, the cohort would have undoubtedly perished. And yet, in the end, he had been defeated. He had been defeated by the Dread Lord, and he had been defeated by the King's resentment, enchantment of the Crown of Twilight. Most of all, he had been defeated by his own lack of foresight and knowledge. He was only alive by chance. Knowing that did not feel great at all. Sunny sighed. Well, one can't win every time. He knew that such thoughts were immature and childish. He had long realized, after all, that his allies were a part of his power, so Their triumph was his triumph, just like his triumph would be theirs in turn. Still, Sonny couldn't help but feel a bit disappointed in himself. He had done remarkably well in this nightmare up until yesterday. Experiencing a serious setback was a change of pace. And then there was the fact that Nephis had to resort to using Shadow Bond in order to make him come back to his senses. He did not know how to feel about it. Logically, there was no reason to be hurt or angry. It had been done for his own good, after all, and brought him no harm. It might very well have saved the lives of his friends, too. In fact, if Sonny had been able to think at that moment, he would have asked Nephis to use her power over him to help him escape from the insidious effect of the king's resentment himself. That would have been a cunning way to cheat the system. But humans were not logical creatures. All Sonny knew was that he could not forget that moment, the horror of having his will violated in such a tyrannical fashion, the hopelessness he felt when his body and soul moved despite his wishes, refusing to obey him, obeying someone else instead. The demented fury he had felt at that time only made the experience so much more disturbing and vivid. That memory was like a shadow that hung over his head. Grimacing, Sonny shook his head and looked around. A moment later, his expression soured. He noticed a pair of hateful eyes glaring at him from a few meters away. The sin of Solace was back, looking at him mockingly. "Finally awake, are you? So how does it feel to be?" "Shut up." Sonny did not let the sword wraith finish and stood up, deciding to go find the other members of the cohort. Nephis was still in the strange state of having had her reserve of humanity burned away by the terrible torment of her flaw. Usually, she would have already been up and about, preparing breakfast for the cohort, but today, that did not happen. Instead, Nephis was simply meditating at the stern of the chain breaker, unmoved and unbothered by anything. The other members of the cohort had chosen not to disturb her. There was a tantalizing smell spreading through the air. Effie had taken it upon herself to cook up a feast, using the supplies stored in the cargo hold of the flying ship without sparing any of the ingredients. Sonny heard his stomach growl and realized how hungry he was. Soon all of them, even Nephis, had gathered on the mess deck, sitting around a table. Cassie had regained consciousness but was still pale. Kai seemed to be a bit out of it, undoubtedly digesting the many incredible twists and turns of this bizarre nightmare. Effie and Jet were, more or less, their usual selves. It almost looked like the good old days when the cohort shared meals together, with the added bonus of having Jet keep them company. There was only one thing spoiling the atmosphere. Mordred was also there, sitting near Sonny and looking at them with a curious expression. The Prince of Nothing picked up a pair of chopsticks and smiled pleasantly. "What's for breakfast?" The breakfast ended up passing in a strange atmosphere, which was understandable, considering that they were sharing the table with a homicidal maniac. Mordred was nothing but amiable and pleasant, but it was exactly his disarming charm that made everyone feel disturbed and uncomfortable. After all, they all knew what the Prince of Nothing was capable of, some better than others. Mordred was not the only one who made the conversation feel stifled, though. Nephis was still detached and impassive. Cassie was keeping quiet, as if she had forgotten how to speak. Sonny was not in the mood to talk, either, concentrating on his food. Kai was deep in thought, still struggling to come to terms with what he had learned from Effie and Jet. After a while, all 7 of them were more or less done with the meal. In the silence that followed, Effie glanced around the table. "So," she leaned back and smiled, "is anyone going to explain what the hell happened in that damned city?" Sonny looked at her somberly. So did Nephis and Mordred, the former without any emotion, the latter with a hint of amusement. At that moment, Jet stretched her legs, crossed them comfortably, and nodded. "Yeah, actually I'm dying to know too." Sonny remained silent for a few moments, trying to imagine the situation from their perspective, then sighed. "Taking a sip of tea," he said. Well, first of all, our base assumption was wrong. We assumed that Twilight had been frozen in the middle of a battle between its army and the invading forces of the Defilement. But in fact, it was a battle between Soul Stealer and the Dread Lord all along. He paused, then added in a dark tone, "They must have breached the walls of the city, which allowed Soul Stealer to consume the souls of everyone in Twilight. That was when he turned on the Dread Lord and tried to consume him, as well, and when the Mad Prince made use of the situation to activate the defensive array and trap them both. So, when I deactivated the array, both of those fiends were unleashed." Across the table from him, Cassie suddenly spoke. "Some of us have a good chance of resisting Prince Mordred's power, but some don't. That was why you two had to be hidden from Soul Stealer." She turned slightly, facing Mordred. He smiled innocently. "I don't like it at all." Sunny stared at the Prince of Nothing silently for a moment, then looked away. "Don't worry. You don't have to be wary of him too much. We are currently allies after all, and he knows that if something untoward happens, this nightmare will become his grave." The threat hidden in his words was not very subtle, but Sunny did not really worry about Mordred. There might have been something really wrong with that guy, but he was not a fool. The exact opposite, actually. He knew that harming any member of the cohort inside the tomb of Ariel would be a fatal mistake. Especially now, right after Soul Stealer had been destroyed by Nephi's, Mordred would not risk making them all his enemies. At least not until the very last moments of the nightmare. Sunny sighed. In any case, pretty much as soon as the array was deactivated, Kai and I faced the Dread Lord. I had to use an enchantment of the Crown of Twilight to resist his commands, but at the cost of plunging into an uncontrollable rage. While the two of us fought against the dragon, Nephi's and Cassie found themselves surrounded by the vessels of Soul Stealer. He paused. "I am actually not too sure what happened next." Saying that, Sunny hesitated. He said that he did not know, but in truth, he did know something. Shimmering runes were glowing in the air in front of him. They read, "Name Nephi's. True name Changing Star. Rank Ascended. Class Titan. Soul Cores 7/7. Soul Fragments 7,000/7,000. Which was already startling enough. But there was something else near the end of the field of runes. Several new strings had appeared there. Those were the runes that truly gave him pause. Shifting his gaze slightly, Sunny read them once again. Aspect Legacy, Memory of Light. Aspect Legacy Description. A beautiful tree grew from the ashes of doubt, bearing fruits of knowledge. Knowledge of fire, mastered. Knowledge of unearned. 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 There were 7 strings in total, with only one of them revealed and described as mastered. So, whatever happened to Nephi's in Twilight had not only allowed her to become a Titan, but also unlocked her aspect legacy. And that aspect legacy was more than a little bit strange, seemingly granting some sort of knowledge instead of relics. Sunny would lie if he said that he wasn't interested in learning what had happened. He looked at Nephi's, hoping that she would explain at least something. She remained silent for a few moments, then shrugged indifferently. "I tried to make my way to the palace, but Soul Stealer stood in my way. Facing defeat, I made a breakthrough and conceived of a new way of using my aspect, just like you had conceived of using yours to take shapes of powerful creatures. So, I used one of my soul cores as fuel and destroyed it to unleash a conflagration of soul flame." Sunny stared at her incredulously. On paper, what Nephi said made sense. He had indeed managed to deepen his understanding of his aspect and create techniques like Shadow Shell and Shadow Incarnation, thus becoming more powerful while remaining of the same rank. In a similar fashion, Nephis could have deepened her understanding and reached new heights of power. But there was a piece of the puzzle missing. So, your aspect allows you to burn your own soul and use it as fuel. But why was the explosion so immense and destructive? She looked at him impassively. My soul essence is especially potent, as you know. The explosion would have been devastating regardless. But yes, there was another element as well. It was sorcery. Sonny raised his eyebrow, hiding how perplexed he was. A sorcery? Nephis nodded. Yes, the sorcery of names. I used the name of wind to fan the flames burning across twilight and absorbed them. Then I ignited my soul and whispered the name of fire. You saw the rest. In the end, all vessels of Soul Stealer were destroyed. The remnants of the defiled horde were destroyed, as well, allowing me to reform the Terror Core and form a new one. She paused for a moment. With nowhere else to run, Soul Stealer was forced to enter my soul. I burned him. Her even tone and motionless face made it seem as though destroying a corrupted titan, millions of his puppets, and thousands of nightmare creatures in one fell swoop was nothing out of the ordinary. The rest of them stared at Nephis in stunned silence. In the end, Effie grinned. Good job, princess. Let's be friends, okay? Sonny was thinking about something else. Knowledge of fire. He had an inkling of what the knowledge Nephis had received from her aspect legacy was. It had to have contained the true name of fire, at the minimum of every kind of fire there was, perhaps. It must have also elevated her already unmatched affinity to flame to entirely new heights. Nephis, meanwhile, looked at Effie with a hint of confusion in her striking gray eyes. Aren't we already friends? The huntress chuckled and raised her thumb up. Nephis tilted her head, remained silent for a few moments, then said, I received a fair number of memories, too, sadly, not nearly as many as one would have expected, considering the death toll of the explosion. Still, there is at least one or two for each of us. We can distribute them later. With that, she turned to Sonny. That is what happened to Soul Stealer. What happened to the Dread Lord, though? How were the three of you able to kill him? He lingered for a bit. Cassie almost died in that explosion. Is Neff not concerned about that at all? A slight frown appeared on his face. Eventually, he grimaced and answered in a dark tone. Well, I already said that the Crown of Twilight allowed me to ignore his commands. That should have made things easier since his most fearsome weapon was taken away. In practice, though, so was mine. My mind. Without being able to think straight, I was no better than a frenzied beast, worse, because even a beast would have used everything at his disposal to survive. He shook his head. But I was unwilling to summon my shadows or work together with Kai to bring the Dread Lord down. That was unfortunate, to say the least. In the end, we ended up outside the city in that floating fortress. I tied down the fiend, relentlessly attacking his body. That gave Kai an opportunity to destroy the amulet which had protected the bastard from Soul Stealer. And that gave Mordred an opportunity to attack his soul, in turn. Sonny glanced at Kai and smiled from the corner of his mouth. The Dread Lord was paralyzed for a few seconds, and our resident dragon slayer used those seconds to drive an enchanted arrow through his brain. That was how the three of us, but mostly Kai, managed to kill him. Kai had also prevented Mordred from taking possession of the Dread Lord's body, which would have undoubtedly given the Prince of Nothing ideas. Right now, he could be trusted not to turn on them because he needed Nephis to destroy the first Seeker. If Mordred had the power to subjugate her with the authority of the dragon's voice, though, who knew what he would have done? In hindsight, Kai's decision to not wait for the results of the soul battle might have saved them all. Sonny gave Mordred a somber look. Gods, how did I end up on the same team as that guy? Noticing his gaze, the Prince of Nothing smiled. Oh, I would have killed the Dread Lord myself, probably. There was a little problem, you see. A seed of corruption somehow ended up blooming in my soul. Luckily, I managed to extricate the infected part and turn it into a reflection before the disease spread. So I am back to being a mere beast. Alas. Now it was time for them to stare at Mordred. What the hell? Who talked about becoming infected with corruption, cutting up their own soul, and turning the contaminated portion of it into an external entity in order to heal themselves. What insanity was that? Then again, perhaps Sonny wasn't the best person to accuse someone of insanity. He was currently living out the devious plan concocted by his past defiled self, after all. While he was contemplating whether any of the 7 people present on the mess deck could be called sane, Jet smiled and winked at Kai. "Congratulations, Ascended Nightingale. Welcome to the club of the I Killed Myself Club. No, that doesn't sound right. Let's call it the Other Side Club. You know, for people who killed the other, evil version of themselves." She yawned lazily and summoned a wisp of mist, making it swirl around her fingers. "So, did you unlock your aspect legacy as well, or at least received a powerful memory? Oh, you could have received an echo, even. Having an echo of yourself would be really weird, right?" Everyone looked at Kai, imagining him having an echo of himself. He coughed awkwardly. No, I did not unlock my aspect legacy, or receive a memory or an echo. Actually, something strange happened." He hesitated for a moment. "I seem to have received an attribute instead, the Dragon Slayer attribute. I am not quite sure what it does." Sonny tilted his head, slightly bewildered. "So, it's an actual attribute. What does the description say?" Kai seemed to blush a little. "Ah, you know, something about being forged in battle, tempered in flame, and quenched in dragon blood, stuff like that." Sonny stared at him incredulously. Well, damn, I bet the spell was generous on the compliments, too. In any case, Kai's new attribute had to have made his friend stronger. Considering the description, it most likely had something to do with durability and elemental resistance. Maybe there was a deeper layer to it, too. The truth would come out in time. Good, that was good. The cohort was finally assembled, and most of the members had already grown stronger. Nephi's had received a collection of powerful memories. As well, considering the strength of the nightmare creatures of the defiled legion, many of them would be of the transcendent rank. Sonny still had 5 supreme soul shards stored in the covetous coffer, so he would be able to elevate some of those memories to the supreme rank, as well. The cohort would be ready to face Verge and Torment, the only plague that remained. Was that by accident, or the result of someone's intent? The will of the Mad Prince, or Torment's own? Sonny did not know, but suspected that one of those two, or maybe even both of them, had harbored plans for Verge behind the Dread Lord's back. He sighed, then looked at Cassie and asked, not addressing anyone in particular, "So what's the plan now?" Nephi's answered immediately, no hesitation in her steady voice. "What else? We sail for Verge, of course." Then she turned to Cassie and asked, "What is the fastest way we can get there?" The blind girl hesitated for a moment. "I'll have to check." She stood up and left, soon returning with a heavy crate. The stone slates they had recovered in the drowned temple of the defiled Sibyl were stored there. It took Cassie some time to lay the slates out on the table, reference them, and come up with an approximate route. In the end, she pointed to a particular slate. There, the shape of a graceful castle was etched. "It seems that the fastest way to Verge is to simply sail downstream and keep going until we almost reach the dawn of time. However," the blind girl put 2 slates that did not seem to have anything in common together. "With what we know about the shape of the great river now, we can save a lot of time by simply crossing it, sailing past the western edge and braving the inner void. That way, we should be able to bypass most of the journey into the past and land near Verge directly." A strange silence settled on the mess deck. Nephi studied the stone slates for a while, then nodded. "This will take us close to fallen grace first. Let's stop there on the way, then, before departing for the final battle." She looked at them, her gaze lingering on Sonny for a few extra moments. Eventually, she said, "If there are no objections." He might have been mistaken, but it seemed as though at least a hint of liveliness had returned to her voice. Well, the words liveliness and Nephi's did not really go together, but it was a great relief to see that her humanity was slowly coming back. She was even interested in their opinions, his opinion in particular. At least it seemed that way. Sonny sighed. "What else is there to do? If we want to escape this nightmare, Verge is the only way." He shrugged. "No objections from me." The others did not have any either. After a few moments of silence, Nephi's nodded. "Onward to Verge, then. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like the video and comment down if anything wrong in the story, and if have any suggestion to a new novel or want next part of any series, comment down. Our target is to get 1K subscriber. There will be surprise for all of you. Stay tuned.